I wanted to make a couple of words of caution, and one is be very careful when you're doing this process not to get anything in the intake ports, washers, screws, whatever. If you do, and one of those things gets past a valve and gets into the cylinder, you'll spend a lot of time and money retrieving that. Secondly, before you put the intake manifold back on, I think it's a very good idea to take a bright light and a mirror and a pencil magnet and to go down into each one of these and make sure there is nothing in them. Once we've got the intake manifold off, we'll need to remove the Smog pump and the diverter valve. The first thing to do is to disconnect the number 2 air hose to the diverter valve. We'll also be removing the electrical to the diverter pump, as well as the 4 bolts that hold the Smog pump to the block. One thing I learned is that you can make your life easier by removing this water bypass pipe. It'll make access to the Smog pump a lot better. You can remove the electrical connector here. There's a bolt that bolts it to the manifold back there, and then just pull out. This pipe goes into the back of the water pump and has an O-ring on it. I'm glad that I did remove the water bypass pipe, because I found that the O-ring was in sad shape, and also there was a little bit of pink crusting around it, suggesting that this O-ring had already started to leak. One thing we found when we were removing the diverter valve was that the hose connecting it to the check valves back in the back, this hose was just totally hard as a brick and broke in two when we were twisting it. I found out that you cannot replace this hose with something you buy down at AutoZone, and this has to be a Toyota part, and it has to have this 45-degree curve molded into it. If you try to use some cheaper radiator type hose, what will happen is when you make this 45-degree bend, the hose will just kink and it won't work. Before installing the Smog pump and the inverter valve, it's much easier to bolt the inverter valve onto the bracket and then go ahead and pre-install at least this end of the hose that will connect to the manifold in the rear. Once you put the Smog pump in place, you'll push the hose onto the pipe sticking out of the rear manifold, and then you'll have to do some wiggling around to line up the 4 holes in the adapter plate for the Smog pump. Then you'll use 2 bolts and 2 nuts to affix it. And the last step in installing the Smog pump is putting the 3 electrical connections back together. These connectors are about 10 years old, and when pulling them apart, it's not unusual for the snap mechanism to just break off. So what I did on this one, these two, the ones that are on the diverter valve, I just put a couple of tie wraps through the snap mechanism, brought it around the body of the part, and then cut them off flush. The Toyota manual does not give you very much help in removing these 2 check valves. They just simply say remove them. I found that these 2 valves are bolted to the rear side of this structure, which is the rear water bypass joint. Likewise, these 2 valves are also bolted to the exhaust tubes, which go to each side of the engine. In my opinion, the best way to get these valves out is to remove this structure with the valve still mounted on it. However, you'd first have to disconnect the two valves from their exhaust extensions, and in order to gain access you're going to need to lift up on this plastic wire protector, move it probably up about 2 inches, and I suspended it with some cord. You're not going to get it to move very much more than that because it's tethered on both ends with these big wiring harnesses. After you've disconnected these two bolts, you can then turn around and remove the 4 bolts that hold the water bypass joint to the engine. Now, then you can lift off this structure with the 2 valves still attached to it. Probably do best using a 1/4 inch drive socket and maybe a wiggle joint to get those bolts out, but they're technically difficult to remove. Here's what I learned about taking out the 2 check valves in the rear of the engine. First of all, the 2 check valves are mounted on the rear water bypass manifold, and what happens is air comes in here from the secondary air injection pump, and diverter valve comes in through a hose into here, and then the air is bifurcated and sent through both of these valves. As I mentioned earlier, exposure is very poor back here, and to try to get around the engine wire protector structure, it's virtually impossible to access these 4 bolts to remove the check valves from the manifold while it's still in situ. Therefore, about the only way to remove this, the 2 valves, is to just remove the manifold. I found that when I took out the 4 bolts that held this manifold in place, I could not lift it up, and the reason was because it was tethered by the tubes that go to the exhaust manifolds on either side. And so these are the 2 gaskets that go between the rear water bypass joint and the engine. They're kind of a compound gasket, but they're metal and with a rubber insert. If you're going to go to the trouble of doing this job, I think it's silly not to replace these 2 gaskets. I think they cost about $12 a piece, and you sure don't want to have to go back in there because one of these things starts leaking after you've taken it apart and put it back together again. Continuing to put things back together, we've put the 4 nuts onto the studs for the rear water bypass joint, and also we've put a bolt into this bracket which holds this tube in place. There are 4 nuts that hold the rear water bypass joint on, 2 on this end and then 2 on the other end. Each one of these nuts will take 13 foot-pounds of torque. We've also reconnected an electrical connector behind this device, which we had to disconnect in order to give ourselves a little bit more access.